I never thought moving into our dream home would turn into a legal nightmare. But the moment we bought the house outside the Homeowners Association's grip, it was as if we painted a target on our backs because Karen, the self proclaimed queen of the neighborhood HOA, decided that our freedom from her rules was a personal insult to her power. And from the very first day we moved in, she stood at the edge of our driveway with her arms crossed, glaring at us as though we had committed some grave sin by daring to live in a house that was not bound by her HOA's petty regulations, muttering about paint colors, lawn care, and neighborhood uniformity, even though none of it applied to us. And as the weeks passed, her hostility grew from passive aggressive comments into full blown harassment, like slipping anonymous notes in our mailbox demanding that we take down our front porch swing because it didn't fit the community aesthetic, or taking photos of our trash bins on collection day as if building a case against us. And we laughed at first because we thought, how much damage could a nosy neighbor really do? But then one morning, we found a letter taped to our door that looked alarmingly official with court seals and legal jargon, claiming that we had violated community covenants and were being sued for eviction, which made my heart pound because while I knew we weren't under her HOA, the papers looked so real, complete with a stamped signature of a county judge, that for a terrifying moment, I wondered if somehow she had found a way to drag us into her little empire. But when I called the number listed for the clerk's office, a kind but exasperated woman told me that no such case existed and that she'd been getting calls from other homeowners lately about suspicious filings, and that's when the puzzle pieces started clicking into place because Karen wasn't just harassing us. She had actually gone to the length of forging legal documents to scare us out of our home. But before I could even decide what to do next, fate threw us the biggest curveball imaginable, because the very next week, a Rayall summons arrived in the mail, a legitimate one this time, notifying us that Karen had filed an official lawsuit in housing court claiming that we were in breach of neighborhood regulations and should be forcibly removed. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my husband, staring at the papers in disbelief, my stomach twisting with anger and dread, because while we knew the law was on our side, the idea of going through a court battle with someone so unhinged made me sick. But my husband just squeezed my hand and said, "We'll fight this, she can't win." And that gave me a sliver of courage, though nothing could have prepared me for what came next. The court date arrived. We walked nervously into the courtroom, expecting some stranger in a black robe to preside over our fate. But when the bailiff announced the judge's name, my husband froze, his jaw practically hitting the floor, because the judge was none other than his mother, the woman who had raised him, the grandmother of our children, the one person we thought was completely separate from this mess. And the look on Karen's face when she realized who the judge was will forever be etched in my memory, her smug smile faltering as recognition dawned, while I sat there in stunned silence, torn between panic at the awkwardness of family colliding with legal drama, and relief that maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally come to light in front of someone we could trust. But of course, nothing about this situation was going to be simple, because while Karen clearly didn't expect her fabricated case to land in front of a judge with personal ties to us, I also didn't know how my mother-in-law would handle the case, whether she would recuse herself to avoid accusations of bias, or whether she would proceed, determined to show fairness despite the tangled connections. And in that single moment, with all eyes on us, I realized that this story was only just beginning, and what had started as a feud with an HOA, Karen had now spiraled into a high-stakes courtroom drama where family loyalty, justice, and the truth itself would be tested in ways none of us could have imagined. The silence that followed the announcement of my mother-in-law as the presiding judge was so heavy it seemed to press down on the entire courtroom, suffocating every breath. And while my husband's face was a mask of shock, Karen's expression shifted between disbelief and fury, her eyes narrowing as if she'd just realized that her carefully laid trap had been sprung shut on her instead. But even then she couldn't contain herself, standing abruptly and screeching about conflict of interest, demanding that the case be reassigned, her voice shrill enough to make the bailiff step closer, as though he might have to escort her out. Yet my mother-in-law, whom I'll call Judge Reynolds here, maintained an air of perfect composure, raising one hand with a calm authority that silenced the outburst immediately. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades on the bench, firm yet measured, explaining that she would hear preliminary arguments before making a decision about recusal, which immediately set the tone that this wasn't going to be a circus, at least not on her watch. And I found myself marveling at the transformation, because outside the courtroom, she was the woman who knitted blankets for our kids and scolded my husband for forgetting birthdays. But here she was a force of law, a guardian of order, and though I should have felt reassured by her presence, the knot in my stomach only tightened because I knew Karen would twist this into another weapon, trying to claim favoritism, trying to manipulate the system to her advantage. And sure enough, when it came time to present her opening statements, Karen launched into a dramatic tirade about property values, community pride, and the cancer of nonconformity, painting us as villains who were deliberately undermining neighborhood cohesion by refusing to submit to the HOA's rules, her face turning red with the effort of her performance, papers shaking in her hands as she waved them around like a preacher at a revival. And I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but I also knew that the more she spoke, the more dangerous she became, because even lies can sound convincing when wrapped in passion and theatrics, yet my husband remained calm, scribbling notes beside me, his jaw clenched, but his eyes focused, and when it was our turn, he rose slowly, adjusting his tie as though gathering strength, and began to speak with a clarity that cut through the fog of Karen's nonsense like a knife, explaining in simple, undeniable terms that our property was not and had never been part of the HOA, that Karen had no legal jurisdiction over us, and most damning of all, he revealed the forged court documents we had discovered earlier, placing them on the evidence table for the judge to examine, which caused a ripple of whispers throughout the courtroom because the audacity of fabricating legal papers was not just harassment, it was a crime, and for the first time, Karen's confidence visibly cracked, her eyes darting nervously toward the bailiff, as if realizing that her obsession might lead to handcuffs instead of victory. But still she tried to recover, sputtering excuses about misunderstandings, about how she thought the documents were real, claiming that she had been misled by bad information from someone else. Yet the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear, and as Judge Reynolds carefully inspected the supposed summons, her face hardening with every passing second, I knew that this wasn't just about a neighbor dispute anymore. This was about fraud, about abuse of the court system, about one woman's unrelenting desire for control spiraling into potential felony territory. And though I should have felt triumphant, I couldn't shake the unease because watching my mother-in-law handle this case was like walking a tightrope over fire, every decision she made scrutinized by Karen's lawyer, who had by now joined the fray with objections and accusations of bias, insisting that the case be transferred to another judge, but Judge Reynolds, ever unshaken, declared that she would continue only long enough to determine whether the lawsuit had any legal standing whatsoever, and then she would decide on recusal, a ruling that simultaneously calmed and terrified me because it meant that Karen's charade could be dismantled right here and now. But it also meant that every word spoken, every piece of evidence presented was under the microscope, and with the tension mounting, the courtroom became a battlefield of words, with Karen's lawyer hammering on about community integrity while my husband countered with property deeds, zoning maps, and a calm recitation of property law. And all the while, I sat there clutching the edge of the table, my nails digging into the wood, torn between admiration for my husband's composure and fear that somehow, against all logic, Karen might still find a way to twist this to her advantage, because people like her thrive on chaos, on dragging others down into the mud until the truth drowns in confusion. And as the hours dragged on, the weight of it all pressed heavier on my chest until finally Judge Reynolds called for a recess, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying just the faintest flicker of personal conflict. And as we stepped out into the hallway, Karen shot us a glare so venomous I could almost feel it burn, her whispered words drifting across the space like a curse. You don't belong here, and I will make sure you're gone. And in that moment, despite the solid ground of truth beneath us, I realized we were standing on the edge of something far bigger than a neighborly squabble, something that could tear apart not just our peace, but the very fabric of family, law, and justice itself. When the recess ended and we all filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that made the air feel heavier, thicker, as though everyone understood that what came next would set the tone for everything that followed. And as we sat down, I caught a glimpse of Karen pacing at her table, whispering frantically to her lawyer, her once perfectly styled hair beginning to frizz from her constant tugging. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a spark of confidence because desperation was leaking through her facade. But then Judge Reynolds entered and the room snapped to order, her robe flowing as she took her seat, her expression carved from stone. And when she called the case back to session, her voice held no trace of the woman who'd once braided my daughter's hair or shared family dinners with us. It was the voice of authority, impartial, commanding, and it carried a weight that even Karen dared not interrupt, though her eyes still burned with hostility. And then the judge announced that before proceeding with motions, she would allow both parties to submit any final evidence related to jurisdiction, meaning Karen had one last chance to prove that her HOA had any legal claim over our property. So, with a dramatic flourish, Karen's lawyer produced what he claimed were newly discovered documents, bylaws from the HOA's founding years, maps that supposedly included our property in their boundaries, and letters from board members, swearing that every home on our street had always been under HOA governance. But as he spread the papers across the table, my heart lurched because at first glance they did look convincing, aged parchment copies, signatures that seemed official, and I worried for a split second that maybe, just maybe, there was something we had overlooked, that maybe Karen wasn't completely fabricating after all. Yet my husband didn't flinch, calmly requesting that the documents be entered into the record and examined for authenticity. And as the clerk gathered them, I noticed something subtle but chilling. Several of the signatures looked eerily familiar, not because I recognized the names, but because the loops and slants of the handwriting bore a striking resemblance to the forged summons we had already presented. And when my husband pointed this out, the room seemed to freeze, all eyes turning to Karen, whose face flushed crimson as she sputtered about coincidences and old family handwriting. But the judge raised a brow and ordered a handwriting expert to be consulted, making it clear that if these were falsified, the consequences would extend far beyond civil court, and the color drained from Karen's cheeks as though she realized she might have dug herself into a hole too deep to climb out of. Yet her stubbornness kept her from retreating, and she snapped back with venom, accusing us of conspiring with the county to alter maps, of bribing officials to exempt our home from HOA. Control. Her words so absurd that murmurs of disbelief echoed from the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered in the gallery. And it struck me then that this wasn't just our battle anymore. It had become a spectacle, a public unraveling of a woman who had built her identity around domination. And yet the cost for us was still deeply personal because as Karen raged, she hurled insults not just at me, but at my husband, at his upbringing, even at Judge Reynolds herself, accusing her of favoritism and corruption. And though the judge maintained her composure, I could see the muscle in her jaw twitch, the tiniest crack in her otherwise unshakable demeanor. Because no matter how professional she was, being accused by a lunatic in front of a courtroom was still an attack, and I suddenly realized how much strain this was putting on her too, how being forced to preside over her son's case against a neighbor from hell placed her in a nearly impossible position. But still she carried on, reminding both sides that the matter before the court was jurisdiction and nothing else, cutting through Karen's hysteria with the sharp edge of authority. And when my husband rose to present our final piece of evidence, he pulled out certified property records from the county registrar, maps digitally verified and stamped by multiple officials, and deeds dating back decades, each one clearly excluding our parcel from HOA control. And as he laid them out, the contrast between his meticulous preparation and Karen's crumbling theatrics was stark, almost painful to watch, like seeing a house of cards collapse in slow motion. And yet Karen, unwilling to surrender, tried to twist his evidence too, claiming the registrar's office was incompetent, that the county was part of a vast conspiracy to ruin her community, her voice rising higher and higher until it broke into an almost screech, and the bailiff once again stepped forward as though preparing to silence her physically, but the Judge simply raised her hand, and the room fell quiet, and then, in a voice that resonated with finality, she declared that based on the evidence presented, there was no legal foundation for the HOA's claim over our property, meaning the lawsuit to evict us was without merit, and though she stopped short of dismissing the case outright, citing the need to formally review the authenticity of Karen's evidence, her words hit like a thunderclap, sending Karen into a spiral of gasps and mutters, while I felt a wave of relief crash over me so strong that I had to grip the table just to steady myself. Yet that relief was quickly tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't over, because even as the judge set a date for the handwriting analysis and adjourned for the day, Karen's glare followed us out of the courtroom like a predator tracking prey, and as we walked down the courthouse steps, my husband's hand warm in mine, I knew that Karen's obsession had reached a dangerous new level. One, where lies were no longer enough to feed her hunger for control, and if the law wouldn't bend to her will, she might just resort to even darker tactics to try to drive us out, and that thought sent a chill down my spine that no victory in court could shake. The days between that hearing and the next court date stretched on endlessly, filled with an uneasy quiet that was more terrifying than Karen's screaming fits had ever been. Because silence from her didn't mean surrender, it meant she was scheming, and every time I glanced out the window, I caught glimpses of her lurking at the edge of her yard, her phone in hand, snapping pictures of our house, our cars, even our kids as they played outside, and though we reported the harassment to the local authorities, all we got were sympathetic nods and half-hearted assurances that they'd keep an eye on things, which left us feeling exposed, vulnerable, as if our home had become a glass box under constant surveillance. And to make matters worse, the tension seeped into our family life too, because though my husband put on a brave face, I could see the exhaustion etched into his features each night, the way his shoulders slumped once the kids were asleep, the way his hands trembled slightly when he sifted through the growing pile of legal paperwork, and even Judge Reynolds, my mother-in-law, kept her distance from us outside of court, avoiding family dinners and phone calls in a clear attempt to keep boundaries intact, which I understood intellectually but still stung emotionally, because what we needed more than anything was reassurance, not silence, and in that void, Karen's shadow loomed, even larger, feeding off our isolation, until one evening we returned home from the grocery store to find our driveway vandalized with spray-painted words. HOA rules apply scrawled in dripping red letters across the concrete, and though my husband immediately took photos and filed another police report, I couldn't shake the terror of realizing Karen was escalating beyond forged documents into physical intimidation, her obsession spilling into acts meant to scare us into submission, and that night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound, convinced she might try something even worse, and as I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock, I wondered how one woman's fixation could consume our lives so completely, and yet I also knew deep down that giving in to fear was exactly what she wanted, which made me cling even harder to the thought that the court would be our salvation, that the truth would strip her power away once and for all. But when the next hearing finally arrived, it felt less like walking toward justice and more like walking into a battlefield, because Karen had doubled down on her theatrics, arriving with stacks of new evidence and an entourage of HOA board members who sat behind her like soldiers ready to vouch for her fabricated version of reality. And though my husband and I tried to stay composed, I couldn't help feeling outnumbered, suffocated by the sheer force of her manufactured narrative. But then the proceedings began, and the judge wasted no time addressing the elephant in the room. The handwriting expert's report, which had been submitted in advance and now lay in her hands, a thick file that held the key to unraveling Karen's lies, and as Judge Reynolds opened it and began to read aloud, the room grew so still that even the sound of pages turning echoed like thunder. And then came the words we had been waiting for. The expert had determined beyond any doubt that the signatures and handwriting on Karen's newly discovered documents matched the forgeries from the earlier fake summons, a conclusion that not only invalidated her evidence, but also raised the specter of criminal charges. And though the courtroom erupted in whispers, I kept my eyes fixed on Karen, watching the color drain from her face until she looked almost ghostly, Her lips parted in disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend that her web of lies was unraveling so publicly, and yet instead of crumbling, she lashed out, standing to her feet, and shouting about conspiracies, accusing the expert of bias, accusing us of bribery, even daring to accuse Judge Reynolds of orchestrating the entire ordeal to protect her family, her voice rising to such a pitch that the bailiff finally had to escort her back to her seat. And in that moment, I felt both vindicated and horrified because while the truth was on our side, Karen's descent into paranoia was becoming unhinged in a way that no courtroom could fully contain, and as Judge Reynolds calmly ruled that the case would be dismissed for lack of, standing, her words crisp and final, Karen's shriek of protest drowned out the gavel's echo, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine because it wasn't the sound of defeat, it was the sound of a woman who refused to let go, who would rather destroy everything than admit she had lost. And as we walked out of the courthouse with a legal victory under our belts, the sense of safety I had hoped to feel never came because Karen's glare followed us even as deputies held her back, her mouth, forming silent words that chilled me to the bone. This isn't over. And though my husband squeezed my hand tightly, whispering that we had finally won, I knew deep in my gut that the real battle had only just begun. Because people like Karen didn't stop when the law told them to. They found new ways to twist, to torment, to claw back the power they felt slipping away, and I couldn't shake the terrible certainty that the storm outside the courtroom was about to grow darker than anything we had faced inside. The dismissal of Karen's lawsuit should have marked the end of our nightmare. A clean break that allowed us to reclaim our peace and finally live in the home we had fought so hard for. But instead, it was like tossing gasoline on a fire, because the very next morning, our world was jolted awake by the sound of pounding on the front door, and when my husband opened it, he found Karen standing there with a smug grin plastered across her face, holding a clipboard and announcing that she was conducting an inspection of our property on behalf of the HOA, her tone dripping with false authority as though the court's ruling had never happened. And though my husband firmly told her to leave, she refused to budge, jabbing her pen toward the porch swing and the flower boxes we'd planted, muttering about violations and fines, until finally he threatened to call the police and she stormed off, but not before snapping dozens of photos and vowing that higher powers would make us pay. And true to her word, within days we began receiving a barrage of letters in the mail, phony violation notices with official-looking HOA letterheads, threats of fines, demands for compliance, each one more aggressive than the last, and though we knew they were worthless since our home wasn't subject to the HOA, the sheer volume of them was overwhelming, filling our mailbox daily until I dreaded walking out to retrieve it, and when we contacted the actual HOA office to report her actions, they claimed their hands were tied, insisting she wasn't acting on behalf of the board and therefore it was a personal dispute, which only deepened my frustration, because how could someone abuse authority that wasn't even hers and face no consequences? But then, the harassment escalated in ways we couldn't ignore. Suddenly our trash bins went missing on pickup day. Our Wi-Fi was mysteriously disrupted, nails appeared scattered across our driveway, and one morning my husband's car windshield was shattered by what police later identified as deliberate vandalism, and though we suspected Karen, proving it was nearly impossible without witnesses or security footage, leaving us trapped in a cycle of filing reports and watching them gather dust in some forgotten drawer at the precinct, and the constant stress began to gnaw at us from the inside, turning our once joyful home into a fortress of anxiety where every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of headlights outside sent my heart racing, and even our children weren't spared because Karen started approaching them at the bus stop, whispering things about their parents being criminals, about us stealing from the community, and though they tried to brush it off, I could see the fear in their eyes, the way they clung to us tighter at night, and that was the breaking point for me, the moment I realized that this wasn't just about property lines or legal battles anymore. This was psychological warfare, and we needed to take back control. So, my husband and I invested in a state-of-the-art security system, cameras covering every angle of the property, motion lights that bathed the yard in brightness at the slightest movement, and even a new reinforced front door that could withstand a battering ram. And for a while, the changes gave me a fragile sense of safety, but Karen, ever resourceful in her madness, simply adapted, shifting from overt acts of aggression to subtler forms of sabotage like anonymous calls, to child services alleging neglect, which triggered humiliating home visits that disrupted our routines and frightened the kids, or filing noise complaints with the city over our perfectly normal weekend barbecues, forcing us into endless cycles of proving our innocence. And though every agency eventually saw, through her lies, the constant intrusion was wearing us down, eroding our patience, our joy, our trust in the systems meant to protect us, until one evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, sorting through another stack of bogus notices, I caught sight of my husband staring out the window with a look I had never seen before, something between fury and exhaustion, a hardness that scared me. And when I asked what he was thinking, he simply muttered, "She's never going to stop unless someone makes her." And though he didn't elaborate, the heaviness in his voice made my stomach twist because I knew he wasn't talking about the courts anymore. He was talking about taking matters into his own hands. And while a part of me craved justice just as fiercely, another part feared what desperation might drive us to do. Because Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore, she was a poison seeping into every corner of our lives. And as much as I wanted to believe the law would eventually catch up to her, deep down I sensed that we were on a collision course with something darker, something that couldn't be resolved with gavel strikes or dismissal orders. And as I lay awake that night, listening to the faint hum of the security cameras outside, I realized that the battle for our home had transformed into something far more personal, a test not just of endurance, but of morality. And I couldn't help but wonder how far we'd be willing to go to protect our family if the law kept failing us. It was in the middle of that uneasy summer when the cicadas buzzed in the trees like a constant warning siren and the air seemed to hum with tension, that Karen's crusade against us reached a level that made even the vandalism and harassment feel tame, because one evening, just as dusk was settling in, our security cameras caught footage of her sneaking onto our property under the cover of shadows, her silhouette crouched low as she poured something from a plastic jug onto the edge of our lawn. And when my husband rushed out with the floodlights snapping on, she bolted like a startled animal, leaving behind the jug in her haste, which we later discovered was filled with weed killer strong enough to scorch an entire yard into a barren wasteland. And the thought that she had intended to destroy not just our home's beauty, but the safe space where our children played sent a wave of rage through me that made my hands shake. Yet, even with the video evidence, the police officer who responded seemed hesitant, shrugging and saying it might be difficult to prove intent, a phrase that made my blood boil, because how much clearer could it get than footage of her trespassing with poison in her hands? And though they agreed to file a report, no arrest was made, which left us once again standing on our porch with the hollow comfort of paperwork while Karen stood smugly in her driveway across the street, her arms folded as though daring us to come after her. And that night, as I tucked the kids into bed, I couldn't shake the gnawing fear that she wouldn't stop until she had broken us completely, that her obsession had mutated into something unhinged and dangerous, and I started noticing how even ordinary moments felt tainted by her presence, like how the children no longer played freely in the yard without glancing over their shoulders, or how my husband and I argued more often, not because we were angry at each other, but because the stress had burrowed under our skin until every little inconvenience felt like another weight added to the pile. And it dawned on me that Karen was winning in her own twisted way, not in court, not legally, but by infecting our peace, by making our home feel like a cage instead of a sanctuary. And I swore then that I wouldn't let her destroy us, not from the outside and not from within, which is why I made the decision to confront her directly, something I had avoided for months out of fear. But one Saturday afternoon, when I saw her, outside, trimming her roses with that smug little smirk, I marched across the street with my hands trembling but my voice steady, and I told her face to face that she needed to stop, that we weren't going anywhere, that her reign of terror was over. But instead of retreating, she leaned in close, her eyes glittering with a strange mixture of hatred and satisfaction, and whispered that she had friends in high places, that I didn't know who I was messing with, that if she couldn't get us out, Through the courts or the HOA, she would make our lives so unbearable we would wish we had left on our own. And though her words were meant to scare me, it was the way she said them, with a kind of deranged conviction, that chilled me to the bone because I realized then that this wasn't about rules or property lines anymore. It was about obsession, about control, about her needing to win at all costs. And as I walked back across the street, my knees weak, but my resolve hardening, I knew that. We had crossed a threshold where there was no turning back, and sure enough, within a week, the retaliation came. Anonymous flyers appeared taped to lampposts and tucked under windshield wipers throughout the neighborhood, filled with vile rumors about us, claims that my husband was a criminal, that I was involved in shady dealings, that our children were bullies. None of it remotely true, but damaging enough to make neighbors glance at us with suspicion, to make once friendly greetings turn into awkward silences, and as the social isolation grew, I felt the walls closing in. But then something unexpected happened, because while some neighbors avoided us, others came quietly to our side, slipping notes of encouragement into our mailbox, telling us they too had suffered under Karen's tyranny but had been too afraid to speak up. And for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we weren't fighting this battle alone. But Karen must have sensed the shifting tide, because her tactics grew even bolder, culminating in the night. We woke at 2 a.m. to the shriek of our smoke alarms, rushing downstairs in panic to find our garage engulfed in smoke from a small fire that investigators later said was deliberately set with accelerants near the trash cans. And though we managed to put it out before it spread to the house, the reality that someone, almost certainly Karen, had tried to burn us out of our home shook me to my core in a way no forged document or spray-painted threat ever could. And as I stood there in the driveway, the acrid stench of smoke stinging my eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that this had gone beyond harassment, beyond obsession, into something criminal and dangerous, and that if we didn't act decisively, Karen's madness would eventually lead to tragedy. And so, with my husband by my side, soot-streaked and shaken, but unbroken, I made a silent vow under the flickering lights of the fire truck that we would not just defend ourselves anymore. We would fight back, not with vengeance, but with truth, with evidence, with every legal tool at our disposal, because our home, our family, and our future were worth fighting for, and no Karen, no matter how deranged or powerful she thought she was going to take that from us. The fire investigators returned the next day with grim expressions, their boots crunching over the charred remains of what had once been our trash bins. And though they were careful with their words, the conclusion was clear enough. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been set deliberately, and while they stopped short of naming Karen outright, their subtle glances across the street told me they knew exactly who was responsible, but without direct evidence, without footage of her striking the match or pouring the accelerant, the case against her was frustratingly weak, leaving us in that same limbo we'd been trapped in for months, victims with proof that wasn't enough in the eyes of the law. And yet something had shifted in me that morning as I watched the investigators gather samples and snap photos, because instead of crumbling under the weight of Karen's latest attack, I felt a strange, burning clarity settle over me, a realization that if we kept waiting for the system to swoop in and save us, we'd be waiting forever. So that night, after the children were asleep, I sat down with my husband at the kitchen table, the glow of the security monitor casting flickering light across his tired face, and I told him we needed to change tactics, that instead of reacting to Karen's attacks, we needed to get ahead of her, to gather so much undeniable evidence that even the most reluctant authorities couldn't look away. And for the first time in weeks, I saw a spark of determination return his eyes, a silent agreement passing between us that we were in this fight together. So we upgraded our security system yet again, installing high-resolution cameras with night vision, hidden audio recorders, and even a discreet drone we could deploy if we suspected her sneaking onto our property. And while it felt extreme, it also gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months, like we were finally setting the terms of engagement, not Karen, and sure enough, within days, the cameras began to capture her prowling near the edge of our yard late at night, peering through the hedges with a flashlight, muttering to herself as though possessed, and when we compiled the footage and turned it over to the police, they couldn't brush us off anymore. not with Karen's face illuminated on screen as she trespassed again and again. And though they still hesitated to file serious charges, they agreed to issue her a formal warning, which only seemed to inflame her further. Because the next morning she stood at the edge of her driveway, screaming obscenities at us loud enough for the entire block to hear, accusing us of spying on her, of setting her up. And though I tried to ignore her, the venom in her voice made my stomach twist, especially when she shouted that the judge won't be able to protect you forever, a threat that landed like a dagger, because I knew she was referring to my mother-in-law, and sure enough, within a week, Karen had filed a formal complaint with the state judicial board, accusing Judge Reynolds of corruption, favoritism, and misconduct, dragging her into the fray in a way that made my chest tighten with guilt, because even though the accusations were baseless, I knew they would have to be investigated, and suddenly it wasn't just our family under attack, but also the woman who had risked her reputation to preside fairly over our case. And as we sat in her living room one evening, an awkward family gathering turned. Strategy session. I saw the toll it was taking on her too. The way her hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup, the lines of worry etched deeper into her face, yet she refused to waver, telling us firmly that she could withstand the inquiry, that truth was on her side, just as much as it was on ours. But I couldn't shake the guilt that our battle with Karen was consuming everyone around us like a spreading fire, and still, even as doubt gnawed at me, Karen's unraveling was becoming more and more visible to the outside world, because neighbors who had once cowered under her dominance now began to whisper openly about her instability, emboldened by the fact that we had stood our ground. And when one brave couple came forward to tell us about how she had fined them into near bankruptcy over a misplaced garden gnome, I realized we weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were the first to say no, and others were finally ready to follow, which gave me hope that maybe the tide was turning, that Karen's empire of fear was cracking. But Karen herself seemed blind to the shift, doubling down on her paranoia, hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on us, plastering angry rants on social media, accusing us of everything from drug dealing to witchcraft, her desperation bleeding through every word. And though it was exhausting, I began to sense that her very persistence was becoming her undoing, because the more she raged, the more credibility she lost, not just with neighbors, but with the authorities who now kept her firmly on their radar. And yet, even as the walls closed in on her, I couldn't let myself feel safe, not yet, because I had learned the hard way that Karen was most dangerous when cornered. And as I lay in bed one night, the faint hum of the security cameras outside lulling me into uneasy half-sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the final confrontation between us and her was coming, a collision that would decide once and for all whether we could truly reclaim our lives or whether Karen's obsession would consume us completely. And though fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve, beneath it burned something stronger, fiercer, a determination that no matter what came next, we would not be the ones driven out, not by forged papers, not by fire, not by madness, because this was our home, our family, our fight, and we were finally ready to finish it. The breaking point came on a stormy Thursday night, the kind where the wind howled like a warning through the trees and rain battered the windows, so hard it sounded like fists pounding at the glass. And though we had settled into a routine of cautious watchfulness, double-checking the locks and reviewing the camera feed before bed, I still wasn't prepared for what happened just after midnight, when the motion alarm shrieked from the backyard, and I bolted upright, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might tear itself out of my chest, and beside me my husband was already on his feet, grabbing the baseball bat we kept by the bed as I scrambled to the monitor, my breath catching when I saw Karen on the screen, drenched from the rain, wild-eyed and clutching what looked like a crowbar in one hand, her face twisted into a mask of rage as she stalked toward our patio door, and for a frozen second, my mind refused to accept it, to process that this woman had finally crossed the line from harassment into full-blown home invasion. But then, the sharp crack of glass breaking jolted me back to reality, and I screamed, rushing to dial 911 as my husband barreled down the stairs, and the next minutes were a blur of chaos. The sound of Karen shrieking like a banshee as she tried to pry the door open, the children crying from upstairs, the dispatcher's calm voice in my ear as I begged them to send someone fast, and then the deafening blast of the motion activated. floodlights flaring to life, momentarily blinding Karen and buying us precious seconds as my husband shouted at her to leave, his voice raw with fury, but she only laughed, a chilling, manic sound that didn't even sound human, and she slammed the crowbar again against the glass, shattering it into glittering shards that rained across the floor, forcing my husband to retreat while I clutched the phone like a lifeline, praying that sirens would start wailing in the distance any second now. But instead, the storm swallowed all sound, trapping us in our own private nightmare. And when Karen finally forced her way inside, dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor, her crowbar raised like a weapon, I thought for sure that this was it, that the months of torment had all been leading here to the moment she would finally snap completely and take from us the one thing she'd been after all along: our home, our safety, our very right to exist beyond her control. And I'll never forget the look in her eyes, the unhinged gleam that told me she wasn't seeing us as neighbors or people anymore, but as enemies to be eradicated. And though my husband stood his ground with the bat, his voice shaking as he warned her not to take another step, I could see the hesitation in him, too, the conflict between defending his family and the fear of what might happen if he struck her, because no matter how much she had done, she was still just a woman, still someone the courts would paint as fragile and misunderstood if the worst happened. But Karen didn't hesitate. She lunged forward with a guttural scream, swinging the crowbar wildly, and the two of them collided in a clash of desperation that seemed to stretch time itself, his bat clanging against the metal in a sickening sound as sparks flew, and for a second I thought she might overpower him, her madness giving her a strength that was terrifying to behold, until finally he managed to shove her back, sending her sprawling onto the shattered glass, blood mingling with the rainwater soaking her clothes, and in that instant, the sirens finally pierced through the storm, red and blue lights flickering across the living room walls like salvation itself, and the sight of them seemed to snap Karen out of her frenzy because she scrambled to her feet and made a break for the door, leaving behind a trail of crimson footprints as she vanished into the night. And though the police arrived seconds later, their dogs combing the neighborhood and their radios crackling with urgent updates, she was gone, swallowed by the storm as though the earth itself had conspired to shield her, leaving us trembling in the wreckage of our own home, surrounded by shattered glass and sobbing children. And as the officers questioned us and documented the scene, I realized with a sinking certainty that this wasn't the end, but only the beginning of something far darker, because Karen had shown her hand, revealed the depths of her obsession. And people like her didn't just stop, they escalated, they adapted, they came back stronger. And though the officers assured us that a warrant would be issued, that she would face charges this time, I couldn't bring myself to believe it. Not after everything we had endured, because Karen had slipped through the cracks of the system too many times already, always twisting the narrative, always finding a way to cast herself as the victim. And as I lay awake later that night in the ruins of our shattered door, my children huddled close beside me on the couch, I made a vow to myself, a vow that no judge, no officer, no neighbor could make for me, that if Karen came back again, if she tried to cross that threshold one more time, I wouldn't wait for the sirens or the gavel. I would do whatever it took to end this nightmare once and for all, because this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming the life she had stolen from us piece by piece, and I refused to let her take another inch. In the tense days following the home invasion, the authorities finally began to take decisive action, spurred by the combination of security footage, witness statements, and the physical evidence for her attack. And though I had feared for months that Karen would somehow evade consequences, it seemed this time the law was finally catching up, issuing a warrant for her arrest and placing her under strict surveillance to prevent another escalation. And while the idea that justice might finally be served offered a sliver of relief, the months of torment had left me cautious, unwilling to relax until she was safely behind bars, because Karen had shown herself capable of anything, and her obsession had evolved into a type of strategic cruelty that made even the smallest interactions a minefield. So we remained vigilant, reviewing our cameras daily, alert to every shadow, every unusual movement, every car slowing outside our street. And then, one afternoon, the local news broke the story. Karen had been caught on camera attempting to intimidate another family on the outskirts of town using tactics identical to the ones she had employed against us. And I remember my stomach sinking as I watched her smug grin on television, the reporter detailing the repeated harassment and the filing of new charges against her. And though the segment ended with her being taken into custody by police, my relief was tempered by the knowledge that someone like her would stop at nothing to manipulate the system until forced to face accountability. And indeed, her first act in detention was to write letters to various officials accusing us of harassment and false reporting, twisting the narrative to paint herself as the victim in a desperate attempt to maintain control, but the authorities, armed with mountains of documented evidence, including security footage, the forged court documents, the poison and vandalism, and the fire attempt, dismissed her claims, noting the consistency and corroboration of our reports. And for the first time, I felt a measure of vindication, a sense that the nightmare which had dominated every waking thought for months was beginning to unravel. And yet, even with her in custody, I couldn't ignore the psychological toll that the ordeal had taken, the way my husband and I both flinched at unexpected knocks, how our children remained wary of strangers in the neighborhood, and how the mere sound of a helicopter overhead made us tense because Karen had planted seeds of fear that even the strongest legal action couldn't instantly erase. And it became clear that while the law could restrain her physically, it could not undo the months of manipulation, harassment, and terror she had inflicted. So we began a slow process of reclaiming our lives, reinforcing security, repairing the damage she had caused, and seeking counseling to process the trauma. And as the weeks passed, the neighborhood began to shift as well, with previously intimidated neighbors finally speaking up about Karen's long history of bullying, lending testimony that helped authorities build a robust case, which ultimately resulted in formal charges not only for trespassing, vandalism, and harassment, but also for attempted arson and fraud. And as the legal system closed in on her, I found myself grappling with a complicated mix of emotions: relief, vindication, lingering fear, and an unexpected heavy exhaustion because the battle had demanded every ounce of vigilance, courage, and resilience we could muster. And while we had survived, the scars, though invisible, were undeniable, and there were moments when I still lay awake at night, replaying every encounter, every forged document, every threat, every act of intimidation, wondering what might have happened if we hadn't stood our ground. But even in that mental replay, there is a spark of pride, a recognition of the strength we had discovered in ourselves, in our marriage, and in our family. And as the day of her trial approached, I watched from the gallery as Karen's bravado finally cracked in the courtroom, her previous threats now empty echoes, her arguments countered by irrefutable evidence and witness testimonies from neighbors, law enforcement, and even experts on forged documents. And though she tried to manipulate the jury and the court with false claims of victimization, her story collapsed under the weight of documented truth, culminating in a verdict that held her accountable for her actions, sentencing her to a combination of prison time, restitution payments, and strict restraining orders that prevented any contact with us. And when the gavel finally fell, the weight of months of fear and uncertainty lifted slightly, a deep exhale that seemed to release the tension from my shoulders, though I knew full well that the psychological aftermath would linger, the sense of vigilance and caution embedded in my daily life. And as we walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, surrounded by neighbors who had quietly supported us, I realized that while Karen's physical threat was finally neutralized, the experience had changed us, hardened us, but also revealed a resilience I hadn't fully recognized, a capacity for endurance, strategy, and courage that would carry us forward. And even though the scars would remain, both in our minds and in the minor physical damage to our property, we were finally able to begin the process of healing, reclaiming our home not just as a place of shelter, but as a sanctuary. And I understood in that moment that while people like Karen may attempt to dominate, manipulate, and terrorize, the combination of truth, courage, and persistence could overcome even the most obsessive adversary, and that our victory wasn't just legal, it was moral, psychological, and profoundly personal, a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of relentless harassment. In the weeks and months following Karen's sentencing, life slowly began to settle into a rhythm that, while never completely free from the shadow of what we had endured, felt more like home than it had in years. Because the legal battle that had consumed every moment, every thought, and every ounce of energy was finally over, leaving space to breathe, to laugh, to rebuild the sense of safety that Karen had tried so hard to destroy. And though the house still bore the scars of her obsession, the shattered glass of the patio door, the faint discoloration from her poisoned attempts on the lawn, and the occasional reminder of the fire she had tried to set, the walls now felt imbued with resilience, with the proof that we had not been driven out, that we had survived and claimed victory not just through the law, but through unity, strategy, and courage. And the children, once fearful of shadows and sudden noises, slowly began to reclaim the joy of playing outside, their laughter, returning like a balm to the raw nerves of our family, while my husband and I worked together to restore not only the physical space of our home, but also the emotional foundation, attending counseling sessions, openly discussing the trauma we had endured, and learning to trust again in the security of our own sanctuary. And even our neighbors, once intimidated into silence by Karen's tyranny, began to emerge from their own fear, offering quiet support, helping us repair fences, sharing stories of their own experiences with her harassment, creating a sense of community that had been absent for years, a network of people willing to stand against intimidation and deceit. And I couldn't help but reflect on the incredible irony that it had taken the most extreme circumstances for that solidarity to emerge, that Karen's obsession had ultimately unified those she sought to dominate. And as I stood on the porch one morning, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over the street, a warm light falling on the repaired flower beds, I realized that the victory was deeper than simply having the law on our side. It was the reclaiming of our peace, our agency, our sense of normalcy. And though the memory of forged documents, home invasions, vandalism, and threats would never fully fade, they no longer held power over us because we had faced them head on, documented every lie, every act of cruelty, and emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more connected as a family. And even when Karen attempted to contact us from prison through letters filled with delusion and false accusations, we chose not to engage, refusing to give her the attention and energy she craved, letting the restraining orders and the weight of justice do the work we could not afford to do emotionally. And in that quiet, deliberate decision, we found an unexpected sense of liberation, a reclaiming of our focus and mental space. And I realized that our story, while traumatic, had become a testament to perseverance, to the power of standing firm in the face of relentless harassment, and to the importance of leveraging every tool at our disposal, legal, technological, emotional, and communal, to protect what matters most. And as the months passed, I noticed a subtle but profound change within myself, a confidence that I had not known before, an understanding that threats, no matter how persistent or dangerous, could be met with courage, planning, and unity. And when my mother-in-law, Judge Reynolds, finally joined us for a calm family dinner after the dust had settled, there was no awkwardness, only a quiet acknowledgement of the battle we had all endured and the gratitude we felt toward her impartiality and steadfastness during the most trying moments of our lives. And as I watched my children run through the yard free from fear, chasing the dog and laughing at their own games, I felt a profound sense of closure because while Karen's obsession had tested us to the brink, it had also revealed the depth of our resilience, the strength of our love and family bonds, and the importance of standing up against injustice even when it feels overwhelming. And I knew in that moment that no matter what challenges life might throw at us in the future, we had faced the ultimate test of patience, courage, and fortitude, and had emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, wiser, and more united, with a story that would serve as both a warning and an inspiration to others facing harassment and intimidation, proving that even the most relentless adversary can be defeated when truth, perseverance, and unity prevail. And as the sun set that evening, painting the sky in warm hues over the now peaceful neighborhood, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of fear lift and the lightness of freedom settle over our home, knowing that for the first time in years, we could truly call it ours without hesitation, without dread, and with the quiet but unwavering knowledge that we had, against all odds and against the obsession of one deluded woman, reclaimed our lives, our peace, and our sense of safety forever.